Italy is in crisis. The country is projected to lose millions of people over the next few decades. Even worse, it's her young people, which will hurt everything from real estate to finance to the military. Let's focus on just one region to really understand it. This is Genoa, one of the oldest and most beautiful cities in Italy. It has everything you would hope for: good weather, better food, and an even cooler past. This city is just missing one thing though: kids. The region is home to 1.5 million people, but only 160,000 of them are under 15. Almost 3 times as many are above 65. For comparison, the oldest state in the US is Maine, where just under 15% of the population are kids, and 21% are elderly. Here are the national numbers. You might think that sure, this is a problem, but it's hardly unique. After all, Japan has become the bellwether for population decline. Its birth rate is now only half the death rate, while the rest of East Asia is not far behind. You would be correct. From the Americas to the Middle East, and especially to Asia and Europe, everyone everywhere has fewer kids than their parents. Population aging and decline has become the norm for the developed world. But in Italy, the issue is simply so much larger. Take Liguria. Deaths don't just outnumber births, they have for more than a half century. They're not even double the birth rate anymore, but triple. Last year, only 8,462 babies were born across the province, a significant drop from the year before, while 23,000 died. In 2023, this threshold was met. The birth rate has continued falling, while its cohort has soared. Fertility would now need to grow more in order to compensate for the shrinking number of people in childbearing age, if the region was to ever return to population growth. Indeed, the province had more people living in it in 1950 than today. One might hope this is an exception, that the province is Italy's Florida, a community that draws in retirees from across the peninsula. This is unfortunately wrong. The state does pull in migrants, just not the ones you're thinking of. 1 in 10 of the population is foreign-born, but they contribute to 1 in 5 of all births, meaning without the politically sensitive migrants, births would be even lower than they already are. This state isn't a unique example. Deaths are more than double births in most of the regions. Only in Liguria, it's a few years ahead. Like Japan, it's setting the trend for the rest of the world. Across Italy, only 392,000 babies were born last year, a record low. Since this trend has continued, Texas will surpass Italy in births this year, despite having a population half the size, 30 million fewer people. The data is clear. This isn't just a problem. This is a crisis. Let's find out why. For millennia, demographics was consistent. Almost everyone worked on the farm, and the lack of contraception meant that couples had many children. However, because health was so poor, upwards of half of kids would die by the age of 5. Around the turn of the 19th century, however, things changed in the West. A series of technologies changed the relationship between people and the land beneath their feet. Everyone moved to cities, and women entered the labor force. As a result, kids went from free labor to the most expensive thing in our lives. Meanwhile, medical innovations and public health campaigns enabled people to live longer, better lives. To measure these changes, demographers created the population pyramid, probably the most insightful graph in the social sciences. Men on one side and women on the other, with age on the y-axis, young at the bottom and the elderly at the top. Here are some examples to show how powerful it is. This one has lots and lots of young adults and nobody else. They're not raising kids, but getting education. It's a college town. They move in, go to class, complain about their professors, and then move out to the workforce. Instead of selling them diapers, try alcohol. You'll make it big. You can see this one has lots of people in their 20s and 30s, but other age groups exist as well. A demographic bulge. One should expect strong housing appreciation, consumer demand, higher births, and soon enough, more school enrollment. But fast forward a decade or two, and 20 years later, everyone is 20 years older. This one has lots of people in their 50s and 60s. You can see they didn't have many kids. In fact, women in their 80s will soon outnumber girls under 10, meaning they have been spending their money on cruises and croissants instead of diapers and daycare. While they never used to dedicate savings towards retirement, now they do, seeing old age creep up on them. Interest rates are low because there is a lot of money in the system and not much taking it out. Demographics hold sway over more than just business and market trends, however. For example, one could partially attribute the populist backlash in the West to the graying of their societies, much like how demographics contributed to the 1960s and 70s, as the new generation of young people protested the old ways. One of the strongest correlations to your net worth is your age. The older among us are wealthier, by a lot. This is largely because they have had years to accrue it. They have assets behind them and few remaining liabilities. They also tend to have more skills and experience, and thus get paid more. Given this situation, they become the main source of tax revenue, a government's best friend. Indeed, in the US, those under 35 pay just 11% of the taxes, just barely more than retirees, with 3/4 being paid by middle-aged and older adults. Let's take a look back at this pyramid. This is Italy as of this year. Few kids means schools close, and being a teacher is no longer a good career path. Try healthcare, or better yet, a different country. Here's why. Most of the world's pension systems function like this. You pay into the system during your working life, supporting those currently retired. Then, when you're 70, the new taxpayers sustain you. They're called pay-as-you-go. It seems logical and reasonable, especially for the time they were created. There is just one catch though. The number of payers and takers has to be reasonable. If the number of retirees exceeds workers, there won't be enough money to support them. In other words, the system wasn't designed to handle demographic shifts. Let's look back at Italy. They have a large cohort in their 50s and 60s, partially retired. The country still has some baby boomers in the labor force, in their prime working years paying high taxes. That means that these are the good times. In just a few years, this cadre of cash will vanish and become a pit of pensions and suffering. Millions of them. Italy is already one of the most indebted nations in the world. With this demographic horizon, the future is even bleaker. In fact, the ratio between those working and those not will go from an already low 3:2 to 1:1. Past 2050, less than half of the population are projected to be employed, while over 35% will be retired. For Rome, there are two options to handle the problem: tax hikes, pension cuts, or hopefully both. Either would be difficult, but both would be impossible. You probably have noticed the trend of countries raising their retirement age, and the riots that followed them. This is why. Countries the world over are aging. In fact, most of the world now lives in places where the number of newborns won't replace the number of adults. So expect pensions to remain a centerpiece in the global news cycle. Italy is at the forefront of this trend, becoming a 116,000 square mile nursing home. Fully half of Italians are older than 47, while a quarter are above 65. Given this, it should be no surprise that pensions are a large part of the economy. Here, I'll let you guess. Is it 7, 12, 17, or 20%? It's C, second only to the economic juggernaut of Greece. For comparison, in the US, it's only 7%. This is what happens when everyone is elderly. The old take up a larger proportion of an already smaller economy. It's no doubt the reason why the new Prime Minister decided to delay her pension reform, rumored to be quite generous. The math just doesn't work. The debt, already nearly 150% of GDP, will only grow. Making matters worse, in democracies, older people vote way more often, meaning not only is the group numerically larger, but also has a bigger share in government. Here in the US, politicians from neither party want to touch Medicare with a 10-foot pole. This is despite the fact that the country is relatively youthful, and the issue is a crisis all its own. In dying Europe, you can see the problem. When the question comes to tax hikes or spending cuts, the former is going to be the option. This is more difficult than it appears though. Because Italy is part of the Schengen area, people can vote with their feet. Many Italians simply aren't going to tolerate higher taxes and a weaker economy, especially when the grass can be so much greener. This logic applies within Italy as well. Young people migrating from the poor south up is a feature, not a bug, one that is centuries old, escaping unemployment, poverty, and the mafia. For this reason, the South looks worse on nearly every demographic and economic metric. As the crisis deepens, Italy's relevance in the global economy will fade. While it's still 8th, it will likely fall behind fast-growing countries like Turkey, Canada, Indonesia, and Mexico. The country's importance in international affairs will follow, both within the Mediterranean and globally. This sounds bad, and it is. But unfortunately, it gets worse, much worse. Just as a population boom has varied effects in everything from finance to housing, the opposite is true as well. Let's start with finance. Remember that lots of people in their late working years are at the peak of their careers, generating the most income for themselves and the government. They tend to spend less and thus have much of it in savings and investments. This translates to more available credit. When these people retire though, that money is gone, meaning not only is the government going to have to borrow more for services to support them, but the relative debt load will be much higher, as the cost of capital will rise. It gets worse. The cost of capital will affect not only the government, but the private sector as well, slowing down growth and business formation and thus employment. Before the pandemic, Italy's labor force was shrinking, a problem but commonplace in rapidly aging countries. Even worse though, unemployment remained high, even as more people left the workforce than entered it. Over the next few decades, demographics will not determine Italy's destiny. That is up to the Italians. But it will shape it. So as the population collapses, keep in mind one thing. Humans are incredible. We have the capability to mold the world around us, solving incredibly complex problems. Italy is dying, but it won't be dead. Make no mistake, it will still exist as a country in southern Europe, an old, weak one at that, in more and more debt, more and more reliant on tourism and her neighbors. But this isn't the first time smart analysts have forecasted gloom and doom, and it won't be the last. Italy will survive. More importantly, however, it's not alone. Europe is more closely intertwined than ever, committed to addressing concerns for everyone across the continent. While the institutions in the European Union are often bureaucratic, completely incompetent, and breathtakingly out of touch, they remain some of the best around. These are some of the most successful societies in the world after all, leaders in education and health, This isn't the first crisis Italy has encountered, and it won't be the last. So while the country is dying, it likely will never die.